delighted to welcome Professor Hearn here to our seminar series, which I think will prove very interesting to many people in the school, because there's quite a number of people who share your areas of interest, and I think you're very welcome. I'm only going to briefly introduce Professor Hearn. He is an expert in nationalism and national identity, and has written extensively in that area. He is more recently interested and written a book on theories of power with a focus on authority and legitimacy. I'm going to let Jonathan explain a lot more about his own research in the course of his presentation. Today he's discussing competition in the history of an idea, which is part of a broader body of work that he's working on. And so I hand it over to you, Jonathan, to make the presentation. I would just like to make my apologies. I'm going to be leaving midway during the presentation, and Dr. Kess will take over and chair the session from there. Okay.
Good. Thank you very much. Thanks for that introduction. I'm still not used to being introduced as professor. That's very unusual. So somebody once said I'd like to leave that sentence. But anyways, yes, I mean, I'll try and convey some more general sense of what I do, but this is a particular piece of research. I'm going to try and, through presenting that, give you a sense. And the other thing to say is, thanks for choosing me over sunshine. I know that's a hard choice. Your souls will be ready for it. No. Thank you very much for coming and having me. The title here, Competition and History of the Concept, that's a very brief kind of description of a more complex process. Hopefully some of these will be not too hard to read. But the context, I'm going to talk a bit about the context and kind of method of how I approach this, and then the bulk of what I say will be about this particular piece of this study. It comes out of a kind of long-term study that I've been working on, started developing on the emergence of the sort of institutionalization of modern, what I call reflexive forms of competition. In a moment I'll say more about what I mean by that, but in a nutshell, by reflexive I mean competition not as just plain and simple something that happens, but competition in the sense of when people, human beings, societies begin very consciously saying there is such a thing as competition, and you can consciously do it to certain ends. That's what I mean by reflexive. The work on this began really when I was lucky enough to get a mid-career fellowship from the Independent Social Research Foundation, fairly new, small charitable funding group based in the UK. Actually, they're based in Liechtenstein, make of that what you will. If you're interested in the Independent Social Research Foundation, because you've never heard of it, I know they're interested in finding applicants from beyond the UK, so I'd be happy to talk to anybody about that. But that gave me a year off from teaching and to think about this and begin the work on it. And it's envisioned, as I said in the grant application, it's envisioned as a very long set of research projects that I will be trying to do over the next several years. It's not a kind of 1 year, it's done kind of thing. And it has several strands. The strand I'm talking about today is what I call the sort of history of the concept. It's kind of in the family of history of ideas, that kind of approach, looking more narrowly at the word itself and how it gets used and stuff. And that's what I'll focus on today. But kind of in parallel with that, I also have other projects that I'm sort of chipping away at or trying to develop for further funding applications. One had to do with what I'm sort of calling it the social evolution of competitive forms. I'm interested in how the nation state, the modern company or corporation, and the modern political party all sort of crystallize at a certain point, coming out of the late 18th century into the early 19th century, and are all transformed and are all forms of social organization that are in their very designed to compete, right, in a new kind of rule-governed environment about competition. So I'm sort of, that's the more institutional evolutionary part of my interest that goes alongside, and I won't talk about today, but is in the background behind what I'm saying about the concept and what we can learn by just looking at the concept. And I also have another line of interest in competition, which is in thinking through how it relates to the traditional sort of anthropological concept of ritual, rituals understood as formalized practices that normally play a role in authorizing, legitimating power relations in human society, and in many ways kind of reflecting back to the society in a kind of summarized form the kind of core values of the society. I'm very interested in the way many aspects of competition, although as secular as it may be as a practice, have many of the qualities of ritual in terms of being rule-governed, led by experts. People come in with one set of social statuses and they come out the other end with ritual, different social statuses. They come in as contestants and come out as winners and losers. Right? So I'm interested in the mileage you can get out of thinking through an anthropological concept of ritual to understand what we're doing when we do competition. And it may have interesting functions that are have interesting echoes in more religious forms of ritual. But that's all for another day. Today I'm just going to talk about the word itself and the concept. But that gives you some sense of kind of the larger scope of things I'm interested in. So just to say a word or two about, again, the larger context before talking a bit about the methods. I mean, the basic argument is that liberal forms of society emerged out of, when I say liberal forms of society, I use that, there are many terms we could use here, but I just mean, some people might prefer the term capitalist forms of society, but I just mean that particular confluence of capitalism, democracy, constitutionalism, rights-based legal systems, that kind of stuff. It emerged out of the decline of traditional religious and hereditary forms of authority. The 18th century is a kind of pivotal transition century, in my view, for the shift, capped off particularly by the revolutions of the British colonies that became the United States, or the French Revolution. And my argument is that the new form of I'm just calling for, in a nutshell, liberal society, takes shape with a kind of chronic authority deficit, because this kind of society is based on a certain core value, which is that everybody should govern themselves. Everybody should, as much as possible, have power over themselves, be self-determining, and the more we can form the kind of society that just naturally allows that to happen, the more legitimate it is. But actually, what we end up is very complex, bureaucratic, hierarchicized forms of society that on one hand want to disown the notion of authority, but still have to do it somehow. So I'm interested in how this kind of ritualized notion of competition serves the purpose of kind of authorizing outcomes and power distributions while appearing to be very natural and not having, it's not a king, it's not a pope, it's not a religious authority that can that tells you what to do on high, but nonetheless it creates legitimate outcomes. So it's a mechanism for allocating power and resources that appears natural, and unproblematically authoritative. But at the same time, it's highly artificial. In other words, part of the basic point here is that the competition that you and I all experience on a daily basis, competition for bidding on houses, getting jobs, getting funding, making an endless list of the kind of competitions that we're all drawn into on a daily basis. These are highly artificial, institutionalized, conventionalized things. It's not, life of the jungle or something. And yet, we understand this, we're often made or encouraged to understand it as a natural process. And behind that is a further point that competition itself, and basically my argument is that competition itself is not new. It is not the case that ever since neoliberalism kicked in, suddenly we've had to compete intensively with each other. It's not even the case that competition only became a very important force in human society with capitalism. If you look back to any study of feudal society, it's full of fierce competition. It's just of a different type. And it doesn't have the form of people saying, we're doing competition because the effects of it will be good. So you have to bite the bullet and sort of accept that, not confuse this, although there's a critical intent here, to not confuse it with a kind of romantic longing for a time when everything was pacific and we all got along. We can change the way we don't get along, but we can't kind of just return to the Garden of Eden, as it were. So obviously I could go on at great length trying to justify that point of view, but the whole purpose here is just kind of give you some sense of what's the very large position that is kind of informing what I'm talking about today. So, how do you go about studying ideas? How do you concepts? How do you do this? I describe myself. You gave me this chair. I had to give it a name. I called myself Professor of Political and Historical Sociology because I was trying to find some raw, descriptive way of saying what it is I do. Right? I'm a sociologist. I'm very interested in politics and power relations, and I'm very interested in historical perspective on these things. And that approach, being a political historical sociologist, generally involves kind of deep, thick, accounting of social relations and institutions and forms of social organization. So obviously, I am not a historian of ideas. I'm something else, but I'm kind of trespassing on their territory a bit. So I thought I'd say a little bit about kind of how I relate what I'm doing to some of those ways of doing things, even though I'm not claiming to be one of them. But obviously the classical kind of tradition of the history of ideas was kicked off by A.O. Lovejoy in his book, The Great Chain of Being, which put forth this argument that medieval society was organized around this idea of a scala natura, this kind of natural hierarchy of power and authority. And it's a very classic kind of old school history, using all sorts of kind of texts and I have in common with Lovejoy that just as he was interested in the Great Chain of Being, because it's a very fundamental thing that explains how people understood power in that period, my interest in competition is like that. It's an interest in a very fundamental thing that is taken for granted, but explains how we think about power. Right? Having said that kind of Lovejoyian, I don't know how to say that, Lovejoy's approach to the history of ideas came in for a lot of criticism. One of the main schools of criticism of that was the kind of what's now called the Cambridge School, people like Quentin Skinner and Pocock, who basically argued, no, you really have to understand the history of ideas, the history of thought. You have to take, what people say in context very carefully, look at who's saying what to whom, a kind of J.L. Austin kind of notion of reconstructing speech acts and all that kind of stuff. So that was a huge influence on the kind of history of ideas approach, and is a kind of school in itself. Now, sometimes it's, and often these guys are kind of half political theorists, half historians of ideas, and they're very interested in similar ideas to me, like liberty and republicanism and a lot of equality, a lot of the ideas that make up this modern form of society that we live in. But that approach also tends to make history seem like it's one endless Oxford seminar or something. These great minds arguing with each other, which again, it's brilliant stuff, but it's not exactly what I'm doing. Another approach to reconstructing history ideas is, of course, the Foucauldian genealogy approach, which tends to say who knows, all attempts to sort of identify an objective pre-existent history that we then go and find are suspect, and therefore you have to say, this is the problematic of the present that's motivating me, and I'm constructing a genealogy of some sort of problem I experience in the present. But a long story short, I don't believe in that. I believe that there is objective history, and that can lead to worse problems than the other problem that Foucault was trying to resist. There is another kind of, these days often, you mostly get talk about history of ideas that's been influenced by the Cambridge School, and parallel to that, a kind of German strain called Berichtsgeschichte. You can correct my German at any point, but that's as close as I can get. Led by this guy, Reinhard Koselleck or Koselleck? Koselleck. I'll just keep looking for the next couple of minutes. I'll keep looking at Andreas. But that's he translates as the history of concepts as opposed to the history of ideas. And they pioneered a kind of method of looking over long sets of dictionaries and encyclopedias at certain words and tracking how they change over that course. And associated with, and there's a huge kind of macro dictionary of the history of concepts that are encyclopedia that Koselleck and a large team developed over many, many years. It's in German, but it's very important work in this area. And he has an idea of what's called the Sattelzeit, or the saddle period, and that the 18th century is a very interesting period in which a lot of concepts have been kind of going on for a long time, and then suddenly with the changes of modernity coming out of the 18th century, you get a lot of change, conceptual change and change in words that is reflected by charting things through these dictionaries and encyclopedias. And then other things as well. So the short methodological point here is simply that what I'm doing most closely resembles Begriffsgeschichte, but I'm not one of them. I'm a political historical sociologist. You know, I'm just kind of putting a toe in that kind of methodological approach to do this part of the larger project. And that's why methodologically this thing I'm talking about is organized the way it is. So the study of concepts, conceptual change, inevitably involves tracking words. It's very hard to do without just sort of focusing on a word and seeing how people are using it, if that's what you want to do. And as part of what I was doing during that fellowship year that I was able to kind of focus on some of this research, was looking at a lot of old dictionaries. Some of them handily are digitized now, but others, you know, just going into library, you know, archives. So there was a sample of 30 dictionaries running from 1678 to 1893, and about 28 encyclopedias from 1771. That's the first edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica up to about 1996. And the dictionaries tend to give you a more narrow impression of just the understanding of what the core vernacular usage of the word is, short definitions. Encyclopedias give you kind of a conceptual elaboration, some sort of larger discussion. And in the encyclopedias I was looking at, sometimes they had entries on competition, and that was very interesting. Other times, there's no entry on competition, but there's an entry on commerce or political economy, in which is an interesting discussion of competition, and so that was also neat. But the focus on these things is to look at, you know, precisely because they were written for the expanding, educated middle-class readership across this period. And because that's what in the first instance, that's what I'm interested in getting at, rather than the kind of high-flown theory that somebody like Quentin Skinner is trying to get at with his approach to history of ideas. This is all in English. I haven't, you know, tried to move on to other languages I'm sure there are many interesting issues. Say something about France for a moment at one point along the way. So, focusing on this core kind of spine of dictionaries and encyclopedias, just literally quite sampling them over that period, and supplemented somewhat by looking at various kind of ephemera that are now in lots of digital archives. There's 18th century online. There's lots of very good digital archives of all sorts of pamphlets and stuff. But it's very hard to say that, I mean, you sort of get a feel that, well, the word seems to mean this at this point, and you take some forays out. It's hard to claim that those other forays out from what you're getting in the spine of encyclopedias and dictionaries is systematic, because there's so much there, you know, we don't quite know how to make that claim. But it kind of, you know, bolsters the argument. And two kind of provisos I would make before going forward is just, I think it's a reasonable method for doing what I'm trying to do, looking at this kind of spine series of dictionaries and encyclopedias. One also has to be realistic, though. It's not, dictionaries have genealogical relationships. So that very often, if you're reading a late 18th century dictionary and you find the definitions, you'll say, oh, they just lifted those from that dictionary 50 years earlier, because you know, they're working on the kind of modern copyright laws and stuff. And so clearly, you know, they are not separate cases in the sense you might want for some kinds of research. And I would also say that we should probably assume that whatever is coming across in these dictionaries lags behind probably what was contemporary usage at the time. Dictionaries tend to be a bit conservative. Certainly if you look at something like Samuel Johnson's dictionary, he's constantly, you know, quoting Dryden, people who are, you know, 100 to 200 years old. You know. So you should assume there's a certain kind of conservativeness or lag in what these dictionaries are telling us. But I say that to be honest, I don't think it undermines the kind of the validity of the approach to trying to track change over the long term. So that's all the kind of setup stuff. I'll start talking about the real thing. more of the text here is very small, but don't worry about it too much. I wanted to start out with a kind of baseline from the present. So I'm looking at, this is a very recent definition from the Oxford Dictionary of English Online. One of the things about doing this kind of work is that all the best sources now are electronic and online, and that makes it more complicated. But, so the definition of competition in the Oxford Dictionary of English Online and most contemporary dictionaries are fairly similar in what they say. Gives us a fairly standard, mass noun definition. It says the activity or condition of striving to gain or win something by defeating or establishing superiority over others. There's fierce competition between banks, or the competition for university places is greater than ever this year. That is kind of the core central meaning of what the word means. And the striking thing is there's a lot of continuity between that and the 18th century. That basic core definition hasn't changed a whole lot. A bit, but not a whole lot. But there are these other secondary definitions. So there's competition as a count noun. In other words, competition in that, I entered a competition. There was a competition for this. An organized event in which people compete. That emerges. That doesn't go all the way back. There's the use of competition in the sense of, I met the competition. It's a shorthand way of referring to your opposition. That is a later development. And then they highlight the connection of the idea of competition with ecology, competition between plants and animal species. And that obviously is a more recent version, aspect of the word. But just starting with that baseline from the dictionary, and I will say some other things as I go along. And then also a baseline from the current online Encyclopedia of Britannica, which is, the Encyclopedia Britannica no longer exists in a paper version. It only exists online. And it's it becomes a very different creature because now, if you want to find something in the Encyclopedia Britannica, you go on, you enter it, and you search up the term, and it throws up a list according to a Google-like principle of, those instances that have had the most hits come up at the top of the list and all the way down. So there's 2,328 items that refer to competition in the encyclopedia. Obviously, you can't look all that. But the top 14 that are give you a sort of sense of the main meanings of the word competition for us today, have a clear tendency. The two main entries on competition, one about biotic interaction, in other words, the sense that's used by biologists and evolutionary biologists and population ecology people, and then competition in the economic sense. So there's an article on economic competition. So it's for the encyclopedia purposes, it's divided into these two master categories that we know are kind of the main dominant categories in which it's used. And then it occurs, most of the other kind of further down the list occurrences are sub-articles that either relate to those two kind of fields of science, economics and biology, or again these competitive events in the count noun sense, like ballet competitions, archery, equestrian, figure skating. It's not until you get to number 14 that you get to a sociological entry about conflict, competition, cooperation, social change, which struck me as kind of interesting. But that the various kind of headings that it comes under gives us some sense of the kind of spread of the word for us today, what its main attachments are with other areas of conceptualization. So the point of this research is that's where we are today, and we also know that we live in a society and a culture where the message of the importance of competition is just kind of around us all the time. How did we get here? And so I'm going to jump back to the 18th century and sort of look at how things went from a rather primitive notion of competition to the present state. And I have to say, when I first started thinking about doing this, some of this was just inspired. Family, young kids, you turn on the TV, it's like, you can watch a show about people competing to be the best chef, you can watch a show about people competing to be the most mediocre singer, you can watch a show about people living in the jungle for however long, it just goes on and on and on. But the popular culture is just drowning you in the idea that well, this is what we do. We just compete all the time. You know? And so I'm sort of interested in how did we get here? Now, jumping back in time. When you go back to very early entries, generally one of the most common phrases that occurs in early dictionaries, most of the things that we recognize in dictionaries really start appearing in the late 1600s and become more common through the 18th century after. It's often a phrase, something like rivalry over the same thing. So the word rivalry is often treated almost as a synonym for competition. Somewhat exception to that, the English Expositor, 1680, gives these definitions: competition, strife, or contending with another for the self-same thing, and competitor. And generally at this point, the only other cognate word variant that comes up is competition and competitor. There aren't any others, right? And a competitor is a rival, or one that stands in competition with another about anything. He that sueth for the same thing with another, sueth here being, not having the legalistic connotation it has for us today, which makes it like a claim or something. Cocker's English Dictionary of 1704, competition is defined as contending for one and the same thing, or competitors, a rival that sues for the same thing. And again, at this stage, it's competition and competitor are the two words that appear. You don't get other variants of the word. Very simple, very straightforward. The thing I want to emphasize here is that the word has no particular association with economics at this point. Right? You're as likely to hear the word competition in regard to people competing over a lover's hand, or the king's favor, or any number of things. It's a very general term, but it has no particular strong associations in the early 18th century with economics. And that's evident in these dictionary definitions, and I think kind of more widely when you look at it.
Almost legal, the way they use the word sue, for example.
Yeah, I mean, like I was saying, I think it's interesting because sue, at this point, I think it tends to have a more of an accurate meaning of just, claims. Although, medieval culture was rather more legalistic than some might realize. But it is also interesting that there's the word, in the very first volume of the Encyclopedia Britannica, when you look up competition, there's a very short entry, and it has a very specific meaning in Scots law that is about who gets property in a bankruptcy situation, and a meaning that's kind of completely lost today. So I think there obviously is some sort of connection to legal language. So I wouldn't be able to say how tight that relationship is. Another thing to ask ourselves if we're looking at the word, if I'm sort of saying the word is much simpler at this time, and it doesn't have some of these connotations that we associate with the word today. For instance, I'm saying the word competition is not connected to what we would think of as a competition, competitive event. The first, counter question to that is, well, are there other words that are doing that anyway at the same time? So, it's not that, that the idea isn't there, it's in another context. I mean, looking at other kind of closely related words, Nathan Bailey's Universal Etymological English Dictionary had many volumes across the 18th century, and it was kind of a good characteristic source. Well, if you look at rival, if competition, definitions of competition generally include the word rival, definitions of rival generally include the word competition. So a rival is one who stands in competition with another. Rivalry, or as we'd say today, rivalry, is another word for competition. If you look at words like contest, or to contest, or contestation, again, these words have a meaning that they still have today. General kind of controversy or dispute or quarrels and wrangling over things. But it's not like the idea of a contest, like a competitive event, is hiding under that heading, if you know what I mean. Right? And if you look at the words like game and sport and how those are used, the emphasis generally in the definitions is more on play, divertisement, teasing, deriding, but there isn't the definitions don't strongly convey this idea of some rule-governed practice where people compete for a certain outcome. But that's not a strong connotation of the words game and sport. Now, we know at this period that all sorts of people are playing cards and playing dice and fighting, having cockfights, and they're doing this, what we would call modern competitive kind of activity. But it doesn't seem to be kind of bedded down in its own kind of lexical home, as it were, at this point. An interesting kind of side sheet here is the word emulation. There was a whole kind of discourse amongst kind of philosophers and the Enlightenment figures and in both Britain and France, a whole language around the concept of emulation as a basic virtue, the idea of that people improve themselves by knowing somebody else who does something really well and wanting to do it better than write a better poem than so and so, or a better play, or build a better machine or whatever. So there's very long entry. There's no entry on competition, but there's a very long entry on emulation in the Encyclopedia Britannica from 1790 to 1798 was when it was published, where this idea of striving to excel or go beyond another is very central. And there's also a long entry on emulation in Diderot's Encyclopedia, which doesn't have any entry on competition or contests or a lot of these other words, but there is a long entry on emulation. So there's, in kind of philosophical circles, some of the things that we today associate with the positive value placed on the word competitive and competitiveness, though that's not there this time. Some of that big work is being done by the concept of emulation in this time as a kind of, the world would be a better place if people would learn or if you encourage the spirit of emulation, so people would seek to transcend others. But it doesn't have quite the same connotations because it's not bound to this idea of a contest in which something is won. It's about constantly outdoing the other because you want the approval of others and you want the admiration. It picks up on a theme that's very prevalent in the Scottish Enlightenment writings of people like Adam Smith and David Hume, this idea that one of the basic human motivating factors is this search for approval from others, right? So part of what I'm trying to say here is it's not, when we're careful, when we look at lots of variations, yes, we can see some of what we're talking about happening in this period, but it's happening in a sort of different way and in a much more high-flown kind of philosophical sort of way. Today, the word emulation still has that meaning, but if you were to just Google it, you're much more likely to get something about how computer programs or digital music reproduces other kinds of music. The meaning is drifted. So, some interesting things to learn from kind of looking at kind of related words to competition. The other kind of point to make is that it's just that the word is elaborated and spreads its meaning over time. One of the earliest dictionary entries I could find of compete, as in the verb to compete, right, is in Webster's Dictionary of 1832. And other dictionaries I looked at in this period, for instance, the Encyclopedia Metropolitana, there were lots of competing encyclopedias, it wasn't just Britannica. In 1845, under the entry for compete, it remarks that to compete is now not uncommon in speech. And W.W. Skeat's Etymological Dictionary of the English Language from 1882 says, the verb to compete came into use very late. So my point here is that it's not just that I can't find the word happening before the 18th century. The lexicographers of the 18th century are saying this is a new thing, right? They're stating that in their writings, and to me that's interesting. That if you would go back to the 18th century and say are you going to compete? That would sound odd. It wouldn't mean anything because the verb implies a category of activity is clearly conceptualized, as opposed to competition in the 18th century, which means a situation of people being in conflict over some limited good. Right? Similarly, the word competitive seems to appear along about mid-century. So that means to say that something this is a competitive system, or people are competitive. And what's striking, again, referring to a lot of sort of wider reading around the dictionaries, but even within the dictionary and encyclopedia entries, one of the things you notice is that the concern with competitiveness often comes up, not in regard to the economy, but in regard to big debates in the Victorian British Empire about how we recruit people to the civil service and the need for competitive exams. That's a very big debating point in the later 19th century, and one of the places where the word occurs a lot. And then thirdly, also in Ogilvy's dictionary of 1882, that's the first entry I found that uses competition in this other sense of, a kind of event. It says there a trial of skill proposed as a test of superiority or comparative fitness, as the prize was decided by a written competition or the competitions for appointment in the civil service. The fact that, as a couple of examples of what they mean, in 1882 they referred to the competition in the civil service is because that would have been a very kind of common sense understanding of how you use the word competition by that point. But these are all things that emerged over the 19th century. For the last wee bit, I will talk about, before I've let aside, this has been very lexical. I submitted a version of this paper to one sociology journal, and they said, oh, it's interesting, but it's a bit too lexical. We could send it somewhere else. And I know it's very lexical, but I actually think, sometimes just narrowing the focus can be quite helpful. But now I'm going to talk a little bit about the much wider story of, well, how does this word start to become more associated with economics and with biology and evolution, which are its kind of primary associations, as we saw in those two main categories for the term in the current, Encyclopedia Britannica online. And I'm going to be just touching on what's obviously a very thick, complex history that I can't do justice to. But one of the points to make is that, again, the association with economics really develops as we recognize it today, develops in the 19th century. If you go back to the 18th century, it's, the concept of competition is there in some interesting ways, but it's not central in the way that we might sometimes think it would be. James Stewart's principle of political economy, James Stewart was a Scottish political economist who left Scotland in 1845 because he was a Jacobite and had to decamp to the continent for a couple of decades, and then came back. He was kind of forgiven, and he wrote what was a very influential book on political economy in 1767. But to his misfortune, about 10 years later, some guy named Adam Smith wrote a book that just completely eclipsed his book. And in the Principles of Political Economy, there's a discussion of what he calls double competition. There's a very specific discussion of how when two buyers are competing over the same thing they want to purchase and two sellers are competing over the same thing they want to sell, the effect of those double competitions is to fix the price. That's this point of sale is the price it arrives at. This may seem bloody obvious to us, but in the 18th century there was a lot of people thinking, where do prices come from? Because there are lots of ideas about natural prices and stuff. So there's this very kind of technical idea that is now just kind of everyday kind of economic thought being articulated at that point. But the concept of competition that comes up most prevalently in his book, in Stewart's book, is the idea of competition between states, mercantilist competition between states to capture resources, species, to obtain the dominant position in that form of competition. So, in many ways, that's the strongest association of competition is with rivalry between states, right? And when you read Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, and as part of this research and the background for a whole other piece of writing I'm trying to do, I did go back and read The Wealth of Nations cover to cover, take lots of notes, and the word competition comes up a lot in various discussions, but my judgment is the concept of competition is not the central concept of The Wealth of Nations. Now, for a lot of economists, that's heresy. You know, he invented the idea, and we've forever been mining his genius. I'm not arguing that the concept of competition is absent in Adam Smith. It's certainly, he has a long discussion where he doesn't use the term double competition, but basically explains the same thing that James Stewart had explained in his book 10 years earlier about this kind of buying and selling dynamic. And he's certainly interested in promoting promoting the removal of various kinds of restraints on trade, freeing up individual actors to compete. But the central organizing concept of the Wealth of Nations is the division of labor. It's not competition. And if you understand what he's doing, Adam Smith doesn't mention James Stewart once in that text, even though he must clearly have read James Stewart. Right? Part of that is because he did not want to be, he was arguing against the mercantilist position. The whole point of the Wealth of Nations is to say we don't need to be competing with each other, going to war, trying to capture resources, and then driving up huge debts, national debts, because of war. His a big part of what worried Adam Smith was debt, national debt. So in many ways, if you understand the Wealth of Nations properly, it is a critique of the most virulent forms of competition in his day. But this is something that's lost on economists because they're not thinking about that. They're thinking about something else. So the whole point there is simply that this, the concept, the economic concept of competition that we're so familiar with now doesn't start there. It's in the mix, but it's not prevalent. By the middle of the 19th century, certainly tracking these encyclopedias and dictionaries, you are getting something much more like the standard, modern, strong association of competition with economics. So this is from Chambers' Encyclopedia, which is, Chambers' journal was a kind of popular magazine, and the encyclopedias were quite popular. In 1862, it says, its most apt exemplification, this is an entry on competition is what's being defined in this encyclopedia entry. Most apt exemplification is a race where all are going to the same point and all strive to be there first, be first there, sorry, I don't speak 19th century English, while though only one can achieve this objective. Some others will have the satisfaction of being nearer to success than the competitors behind them. So next time you're licking your wounds, just remember that's the good stuff. The most important practical use of the word competition is in the political economy of commerce, where it is the great motive power of production and enterprise. Now, we all recognize this idea that competition is absolutely central to how commerce and modern economies work, and at that point it's clearly being stated. But if you were to go back, entry on political economy in the London Encyclopedia of 1829, there's no entry on competition, and in the entry on political economy, the discussion of competition is not in this form. It's actually about a debate between Smith and Ricardians about whether or not it is in the nature of capitalism for there to be a diminishing return in profits to capital. Smith thought that was the case, much like Marx, although he just didn't think it would destroy the system. He thought it would just stabilize with lots of capitalists making very little profits. But it's not a discussion. It doesn't have that kind of gung-ho, attitude that this kind of quote suggests. It's a much more, there's this question about how does competition work in this way. And even in the Globe Encyclopedia of 1879, entry on competition, again, it's a much more, I won't go into it because, I want to kind of wind this up, but it's a much more kind of reserved, even-handed, and not, and sort of suggest, well, competition is a part of life in general, but it's not that unique to economics. So this version, which we recognize today as sort of the kind of quintessential expression of the relationship between competition and economics, is even in the 19th century not necessarily the dominant view. A little bit about Darwin. In reading through all these, I always do this thing where I'm going from left to right for myself, but for you guys it's backwards, so left to right. In reading through this series of dictionaries, and treating that as a kind of spine, it is noticeable that there's a point, increasingly in the 19th century, where what we mean by competition is being influenced by what political economists mean by competition, till we get to that midpoint. You kind of see it, and you can see Smith kind of influencing things, but also others, Malthus and Ricardo, of course. Similarly, there's a point where Darwin sort of enters the discussion, and you can see, kind of with a lag, by the later 19th century and into the early 20th century, Darwinian ideas and formulations being infused into the concept. You kind of see it sort of bleeding in. But in contrast to what I just said about Smith in regard to competition, I think it is the case that the concept of competition, that word, the concept, is absolutely central to Darwin's theory of evolution. There is no, I would not make the same argument about Darwin that I just made about Smith, that economists have kind of misconstrued and exaggerated the importance. If you read Darwin carefully, at critical junctures where he says how this process works, competition is there. But it takes a while for it to fuse with wider sort of economic discourses and kind of general social science discourses. I'm going to note here, and I won't go into it, but just there's a complex issue here because Herbert Spencer was probably one of the main popularizers of the idea in the interim between the later 19th century. But his concept of evolution isn't very closely tied to the concept of competition. It's a complicated story, but I'll leave that to one side. But by the time you get to period of sort of 1900 and 1930s, you're starting to get this general integration of Darwinian theory into discussions of competition in economics and social science more generally. So the Encyclopedia Britannica in 1903 on economics has is starting to incorporate this sort of Darwinian language into the concept, and using terms like the struggle for survival and stuff like that. And in the Chambers Encyclopedia, that quote that I just read to you before, the 1936 version of the Chambers Encyclopedia has inserted the line, "In political economy, it is simply the form taken by the struggle for existence as applied to industry." So you're getting this language, struggle for existence, this kind of Darwinian language, increasingly inserted into talk. And there are some very interesting things. There's a fascinating article in the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences by kind of legal economics scholar, kind of institutional economics scholar of the period named Walton H. Hamilton, about competition. It's a very long entry in the Encyclopedia of Social Science, which is a great thing to wander around in if you're sort of interested in the history of social sciences and social thought, in which he goes quite in length talking about the idea of competition as a basic kind of sociological concept for analyzing how society works, not just in economics, but in politics and across all spheres. So my point here is that across that whole period, you get a kind of, competition is moving into a kind of fairly central position in the kind of vocabulary of social science concepts. But then, after World War II, and with the collapse of the popularity of the idea of social Darwinism, that tendency tends to fade away, and from that point on, increasingly, when you look for definitions of competition, it's treated strictly, like in social science encyclopedias, under competition, it will be treated as strictly as an economic concept. It's been hyphened off, separated from wider kind of sociological analysis. So you get this kind of bifurcation, which is perfectly understandable. I'm saying that that's kind of the beginning of heading towards the point where we are today, where there's biological evolutionary science over here, economic science over here. They both have a strong purchase on and sort of ownership of the idea of competition, but they kind of stay out of each other's way. And if you're not doing one of those two things, it's less central to what you do. But part of what I'm trying to say is, well, why is that? Why isn't competition a central sociological concept in the same way that role and status and lots of other things, institutions, lots of other things we use? That those associations are artifacts of the history of ideas. They're not necessarily true in any simple sense.
Sorry, just on that bifurcation, when you suggesting bifurcation, are you suggesting that the notion of competition in the Darwinian camp is different from the notion of competition in the economic camp, or what?
Yeah, well, I'm breezing over a lot of stuff because obviously you can find some people, economists who very consciously borrow from, from the biological concept. My point there was more that those two groups own it, and they may be in dialogue with it, but the rest of us are kind of, somewhere else. Right?
So you're not making any point about two different uses of the term competition?
Not today. In the sense that, because of, I've scratched the surface enough to think, there's a whole lot more to think through here. But even in biological science, I think you can get a sense of, though it's very hard to explain evolution as a process without the concept of competition. A lot of the people who write textbooks and stuff are going to some effort to sort of say, well, there's competition, but there's also cooperation, and there's symbiosis, and there's a whole, it's not just that. They're trying to get away from the kind of really crude, red and tooth and claw version of competition. One of the issues here is that people often talk as though competition in the evolutionary sense always leads to the extermination of one or the other competitor, right? But one of the main effects of competition is differentiation, right? That species get out of each other's way and specialize on, maximize their differences. All those Darwin's finches and galapagos, So that competition has various effects. It doesn't just have, cutthroat effects, right? And I'm not saying there's any traffic there, but in some sense, apart from people concerned with human biology, human evolution, general evolutionary biologists are not quite saddled with the same burden of, is competition both a descriptor of the system and a virtue of the system that should be championed and inculcated? There's an interesting difference there in terms of how the concept has to function in many places. And that's why generally most of us around this table would recognize the economic version as being rather ideologically weighted. It's got a certain spin on it. Precisely because competitive has emerged since the 18th century, and it is a virtue as opposed to just a descriptor. So if I were to develop the argument of how is it different, it would have to do with these.
So are you saying something like there's two different language games emerging here? There's a kind of a language game in terms of a kind of biological language game and an economic language game, and they may be using the same word, but they may be very close or they may not, but they're being developed in separate ways.
Yeah, to different purposes, as it were. Again, all this, the average person who uses the word competition probably has murky associations with both those meanings of it, that are kind of, informing. And that's part of where I was starting from, is that we talk about competition as, we have this naturalized understanding of it, both because it's so deeply institutionalized in our daily practice that we're just used to it. It's naturalized in that sense. But it's also naturalized in the sense that if there may be no God, and it may be that this family hasn't inherited the right to rule us all, but there is a natural world that works according to this principle, and if that principle is understood as actually secretly underlying the economic principle, then it's doing some of that naturalizing function. Everything I just said there is kind of, we all know that, I know, but I'm just sort of saying, but it's also doing these kind of, as you put it, separate language game things at the same time. And the differences between those language games are also interesting. Right? But I'm also, this is separate, but I'm interested in why, if you, as a sociologist, you want to say, what have sociologists said about competition? Weber said some stuff about competition. Zimmel had an interesting essay on competition. Mannheim had an interesting essay on competition. Hayek's not a sociologist, but he says some interesting debatable things about competition. But there's a kind of, it's not a core concept for us. And maybe it should be. That's not to say, I don't mean in the sort of hurrah sense of the economists. I mean in the analytic sense. We're almost phobic about the concept in a funny way, especially since post-World War II. Right? And that's, in the sociology of the social sciences, that's an interesting question about who picks it up and uses it. obviously tell another story about political science, which has more space for the concept of necessity, because one of the things they study is polarized political competition. So I'm sort of interested also in that kind of, how the concept becomes prominent or background in different disciplines and why. I'm aware I'm stretching my time and I'm trying to bring people's patience, so let me just sort of wind this up and then answer more questions. So the upshot of all this is the last slide, I promise, is that I think there's virtue in tracking lexical change like this, kind of bracketing out the kind of high-level theoretical stuff. In some sense, I would like to spend a lot more time on Darwin and Adam Smith and Spencer and Malthus and the whole kind of more traditional intellectual history that goes alongside the story. But I think there's virtue in trying to sort of put that to the side and kind of use this kind of lexical spine as a way of kind of getting some sense of the change. As I'd like to say to graduate students, most graduate students in the room still. Often when the end goes out to the field, we're thinking, how am I going to get enough data? Well, I have enough data to write my PhD. But actually, the problem of social science is not getting data, it's getting rid of data systematically. That's the real problem of social science. There's too much data all the time. What you want to find a way to slice through it. And that's what I'm trying to do, is find one slice that allows us to see kind of in sort of spinal, kind of skeletal form some of the changes. And to summarize what's some of the points I've been trying to make. One is that from the 18th century to the present, you get this kind of ramification of the concept. The verb to compete arises, the notion of competitive and competitiveness develops over the notion of competition as a count noun kind of event arises, which all point towards this sort of elaboration of the concept because of its central importance. You get its increasing assimilation to the language of political economy across the 19th century, as I suggested, and this infusion of Darwinian ideas into the popular concept in the late 19th century into the 1930s. But then that changes after World War II, and the rise of the kind of modern higher education and participation in the social sciences, in which it becomes, again, different sciences have their version of the concept, which are genetically related, but are kind of how they do it, and others back away from it, precisely because it's got uneasy connotations that we don't quite want to deal with. I'll stop there. Sorry if I went on too long.
No, just my name is John Flann. I'm actually in the law school. I'm a sociologist as well, so I will bring some aspects of the law which you allude to, but seem to be missing from this. I mean, I realize you just slice through using the term there. But if you look at the 19th century, we've got the same in the US. We've got the rise of the cartels, for example, coming up, and then the introduction of antitrust. I didn't use the word not competition, but it's antitrust. So it's a different phraseology, but are clearly related to that. And that's something which has really gathered strength over the 20th century, globally, really. So the idea of competition regulators are such that no business can do something without maybe having to get the agreement from the Chinese, the US, and so on. It's really quite a major spread in that way. And that, to me, sort of takes in a whole variety of things which you've been talking about, because in your earlier listing of words, there were things like games and contests and so on, and that's very much part of the language at the moment now. Using notions of game theory and gamification to analyse these issues. What was the contest between things, dispute, so a legal thing in that way. And then finally, of course, I suppose the thing about Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations was that the rule of law was the bedrock to make that work in a way. And so, although the dictionaries don't appear to assert it, it's a very law-laden concept in a way, or rather it's become more legalized, juridified during the 20th century than it was back in the 19th in a way. And I would say that in some respects now the lawyers have almost co-opted it for their own use in a way.
Can I respond to that? Yeah, I mean, when I first started doing this research, of course, you start any new research project, what do? You just Google the word and see what happens. And you get this endless list of things having to do with basically European competition law. I mean, it's just massive, right? And so absolutely, there's something about this project. I'm particularly interested in the minimal pre-modern capitalistic economic meaning of the word and how it gets sucked into that. And so this account is mostly kind of 18th to 19th century, a little bit in the 20th century, but you're quite right. Over that period, I mean, one of the points, again, of starting with this idea that there's this very interesting tension between the claims to naturalness of competition and the basic artificiality, because it's artificial in the sense to really make it happen. You have to use law and game-like thinking to set up the rules to make it happen, right? So there's this, deep into the concept, there's this tension between let's create a game or set of rules through the law that will allow what naturally should be happening to happen. The Freiburg School in a nutshell, you know what I mean? That itself is a whole side story. Is kind of the rise of ordoliberalism and its kind of influence on competition law. Because one of the reasons it's grown so much is precisely because the European Union has decided quite consciously from the beginning to deal with this, partly because that tradition is feeding into it, rather differently from the United States, which just kind of stumbled into it, and the Sherman Act and these things were kind of just enough to keep people from rebelling, but they were pretty toothless, and so there's a very, again, the way I would try and fit that into my general account was to say, Americans stumbled into the capitalist system, but Europe went there on purpose. And so, as it went there on purpose, it very consciously, takes up this question of competition as a legal principle, both the restraint of, or trying to prevent monopoly, but also just trying to set up the game.
But just to sort of follow up very quickly, in my own area, which tends to be the professions, the concept of monopoly is also a natural one. So we take the legal profession, it thinks quite naturally in the UK, in the US and so on, that it should have a monopoly of certain activities, for example. Now in the UK and in Scotland, competition's been introduced through reforms in the last several years or so. And watching monopolists try to come to terms with the ideas of competition is really quite surprising. I find it incredibly difficult to do. It's not something that naturally, it's not something natural that people could do. They really have to sort of make a huge change in this way. And so, I'm sort of quite intrigued by how people adapt to different systems.
I mean, we just have two more, maybe you can then try to answer.
Yes, so do I have to get down to really quick question? One of the things I was remembering, there was you talked about this difference between the biological and social, but as I remember, Darwin was very heavily influenced by Malthus. We forget about how important Malthus was. People always talk about Spencer and Smart and Fist, but Malthus's ideas about resources, etc., was a strong influence. I think Darwin explicitly says that's where he got the idea. And secondly, I just want to know your methodology. You're talking about these writers, dictionary entries. In some ways, it seems to be looking at them as descriptions of what's happening in the world. Could you also see them as performatives? I mean, these are practical categories. They're actually creating that idea of competition at the same time, rather than just describing what's going on out there. I'm wondering, are you looking at them with them?
Yes, I mean, I'm trying to take quickly in order. I mean, absolutely right. I mean, Darwin read Malthus and read Smith, and it's quite clear that those ideas were in his mind. But I think you can argue that, I mean, Malthus's argument was ultimately was kind of the depressive argument about population outstripping resources, and if you didn't have Darwin's insight into this, but there's this kind of beautiful effect of that, it creates life and change and all that kind of stuff. So absolutely, there's a complex reciprocal relationship between these evolving economic and biological discourses. Like I said, I nailed my colors to the mast early on and said I'm a kind of realist, and I don't think Darwinian theory is just a construction. I think it is a description of how the biological world works. The other point was, performative. Absolutely. I mean, I just, but it's, really to understand these processes, I think you have to see it as a kind of feedback loop. On one level, what they see themselves doing is, telling an informed public, what this word means and what it means when people want to use it. They are describing it, and that's what any modern dictionary lexicographer would say is our job. But inevitably, doing that has a performative effect, and it codifies it. I don't think that, it's difficult. Like something like Chambers' dictionary, the authors of that, if you read through Chambers' dictionary, it sort of epitomizes, encyclopedia, it kind of epitomizes that sort of Victorian spirit, if you know what I mean. And so all its entries will have a certain kind of ideological flavor to them, somewhat different from other dictionaries. And just things that one could, look at. But it's not. Again, I think it's it's a very complex kind of feedback process, and I do think there is. It's a chicken and egg question.
Yeah.
Kieran? Well, on a similar point, obviously Darwin is very influenced by Malthus and the overall liberal tradition. But can I just put a small question on the centrality of competition in Darwin? Because surely the master concept is natural selection, which happens primarily through the mechanism of random variation. There's random variation within the species, depending on the particular environment you're in. That will lead to greater differentiation. Now, we can overlay that with competition, scarce resources, and so on. But that's a very different concept to the economic competition. Economic competition is purposeful. It's not based on random variation. If you think of a modern corporation, it's their ability to mobilize resources, find the market. So it's extremely purposeful. It's about mobilizing resources. And the argument, presumably, is it's the process of competition itself, the market, which makes the corporation better or more efficient or productive. That's quite different to what Darwin was talking about. Darwin was talking about natural selection by means of random variation. So is it in fact the central concept of Darwin? And, isn't there a bit of a problem? I mean, obviously Spencer is the complete ideologue in terms of using Darwin and turning him into essentially an argument against the welfare state. But that's a very much an ideological reason of Darwin.
Yes, but if you look at the points where Darwin is explaining, the thing about the origin of species is it's got long passages that are just descriptions of some species, very kind of material descriptions of developments of certain species. But at the various points where he comes down and says, well, the conceptual mechanism here is the word competition is there.
I'm sure, no, not denying
Is there in the concept of natural selection.
Yeah.
So, so yes, there is this difference. Again, it goes back to this point I'm making about how the pas de deux between the kind of artificial and natural senses of the word, in that yes, economists will say, it's a conscious thing. People are consciously competing. They're trying to make that all happen. But behind it is an idea that whatever their individual conscious, understanding of it is, what they create is a kind of ecology in which some things succeed and some things fail. And And the idea that most economists have of natural selection is fairly, of competition, is related to what Darwin meant by natural selection. It has a similarity, even if there's kind of deliberate, intention involved in the process. That's what, Hayek is an interesting figure here, because precisely, he's a person that kind of expresses this the most distinctly, is that this idea of spontaneous order. The economy is a spontaneous order that arises precisely out of competition between different actors, and if you interfere with it in any way, you will worsen the results. He for me kind of shows up the kind of family relationships between the two.
One last one, and then I think we.
I'm having some difficulty with your methodology, if you like, in a sense, and I'm also having difficulty with maybe the nature of the project. Forgive me, but in a sense, using a dictionary, what you're doing, what you're picking up effectively is the relative influence of different disciplines. Which of them becomes kind of institutionalized as part of the kind of common sense. That's what the way you use it in such a way is that most people understand it this way. And did it come from biology or did it come from economics? So partly you're getting the relative influence of different disciplines at different times.
Yeah.
The second problem I'm having is that it seems to be very difficult to study an individual concept without looking at related ones. So for example, you're right in saying, of course, sociology don't use competition very much, but they use things like achievement and individualism, which are so closely related, not to be, they're not that different in a sense. In other words, they're integral to the notion of competition as we understand it. So that it's partly a struggle of the disciplines, if you like, and we'll keep away from what economics are doing, and we instead we look at achievement or need achievement or mastery or individualism. In other words, these are the concepts that sociology has taken on board, if you like, which are not irrelevant to the study of competition, but yet they're not strictly competition because the language is different, but the processes are actually quite similar. So that's the difficulty.
There were two more, and then really quick. Keep it short, guys, and then short answer, hopefully. Sorry, it was Jerry, and then you. Just quick, keep it short.
Okay, following along that point, it sounds like to me that conflict is what sociologists use. We have a tradition, but for us following Zimmel and Weber on the Goffman, conflict is inherent in human nature, or in at least the interactions between people. And then we try to develop norms in which to control conflict, and hence that's how society is produced. And that's part of the reason why we're against the economists, because we're critical of this idea that competition is natural and that there should be a competitor who wins. So I think there's a lot of family resemblances, but there's also a critique of competition through conflict. But there's also family resemblance in the sense that, in a way, we use conflict as a naturalized concept also, whether it's internal to us as human beings or as an outcome of interaction, which is similar to competition, in both biology and economy.
Apologies for mixed, so that I might ask two questions that were answered in the presentation, but I simply got the timing wrong. First question, what's the relation between markets and competition? So is there actually competition without markets? Second, in response also to your question, how did the sociology concept of competition actually evolve? Because if you read Patrick Asper's or other new developments, they have completely different take on competition and simply need a triangle of two people competing for one good or service, compared to the kind of more atomic economic perception of markets, where you need several kind of actors within a market to create the competition. So kind of the sociological basic definition of competition is just two people competing for one good or service. And that's kind of completely at the odds, and I'm not sure whether you covered that, but concluding, you only cover economic and technological applications, so I wonder what the sociological take is on it.
You had 2 points. The first point, I think I'm in full agreement. I think maybe I didn't catch the force of the question, but I will suggest that these outside disciplines have at certain points influence and kind of send the direction of the popular concept. Achievement, yes, but I mean, the word achievement, and achievement, all that kind of stuff that kind of drifts from economics into sociology, it's much more closely related to something like the notion of competitiveness than competition in the sense I'm talking about it, right? So I mean, certainly it would be very interesting to do that. I can only do so many things at once, and that's not what I've done today. But it would be interesting to look at the concepts that are like competition, but perhaps get more airplay in sociology, and why is that? And that kind of relates to what you're saying, right? Yes, and I mean, I don't remember that 14th entry in the online encyclopedia says, sociologists, when they're talking about this, they're talking about conflict, competition, social change, and you're quite right. I guess my point would be, what is competition? Competition is a way of controlling conflict. I mean, it's not, we have all this kind of critique about the naturalization of competition, but there is a positive argument to be made for setting up some formal procedures for competing over things rather than just tearing each other apart. I'm not here trying to be the proponent of competition necessarily, but I think it's got a role to play. What's the relationship between markets and competition? That's a huge question. Yes, I mean, markets are, in the modern sense, are understood as based on competition as being one of the main arrangements. As was just being said over here, it's the idea is that markets, to some regard, are rule-governed activity that have basic elements set in place and managed by states to make them happen. And part of what they're trying to make happen is competition. But I don't, beyond that, I'm not quite sure what the question is trying to get at. And I don't, at the very beginning, I pointed out to the fact that very early definitions of competition say competition is just two people who are rivals over the same thing. That is the kind of primitive early definition of the concept. It's news to me that is the sociological concept, but it's certainly, that is kind of at the core. And you're right, there's something about this whole transformation that I'm talking about, that part of sucking it into the kind of political economy, economic discourse, is this kind of generalization. If you were in the 18th century or 17th century, it's much more likely if you were talking about competition, you would be talking about a couple of people coming up against each other over something that they wanted, whereas it gets elaborated into this idea of a community of atoms, all competing, for this general systemic effect. I mean, that is part of the elaboration of the concept.
Okay, thank you very much. And if you want to join us, maybe, I don't know, you still have a coffee?
Yeah.
Go down and if you want to join us and maybe have a question that you want to raise.
Yeah, I'm happy to
didn't have a chance to ask.
Yes, I can do this all night, so if you can just keep asking me questions.
Or just invite me to a coffee or a cake, even better. Thanks for coming, guys, and